Hey, everybody, welcome back. I want to talk in this lecture about a philosopher by the name of Edmund Gettier. And Edmund Gettier just died recently, actually. He's just now an historical figure, I suppose, but a 20th century philosopher. And he wrote a very famous, very celebrated paper in the 60s. And it was about knowledge. And it actually was just a seminal paper, really one of the major philosophical works of the 20th century, even though it was only about 3 pages long. And in this paper, what Gettier does is to attack what was a broadly understood, broadly accepted analysis of the concept of knowledge. Okay, so Gettier's project, I'm just going to write a few notes here so we are all on the same page. Gettier's project is, let's highlight this, destructive, right? And in particular, as I said, he's attacking a particular analysis. So remember the idea of conceptual analysis. Think back to what we were talking about a couple weeks back. So when we were talking, for example, about the Euthyphro. And in particular, Gettier is concerned with an analysis, a conceptual analysis of what we might call the knowledge of facts, what philosophers often call, fancy word for the day, propositional knowledge. Right? That is the knowledge of facts, what we mean when we say things like, Bob knows that the sky is blue, or Greg knows that 2 + 2 is 4, or Jim knows that the Bengals won the game last night, or whatever, right? Any kind of claim like that, knowing that something happened, knowing that such and such is true. And the reason that we're sort of making this point is that we want to distinguish this from other uses of the English word knowledge. Oh boy, distinguish from. So, for example, um, knowing a person, right? We might say, Bobby knows Mark, they're friends, right? Bobby and Mark are friends. Bobby knows Mark, Mark knows Bobby. But that kind of knowledge, notice, right? That's some kind of knowledge like acquaintance or something like that. Bobby is acquainted with Mark, Mark is acquainted with Bobby. And that's not the kind of knowledge that we're concerned with here, right? It's not the kind of knowledge, at least not obviously the kind of knowledge that, say, Descartes was thinking about. He's thinking about the knowledge of facts, or again, as we often call it, we being philosophers, propositional knowledge. Okay. So what we're saying here is that there was a kind of de facto analysis of propositional knowledge that was broadly accepted in the philosophical community at the time that Gettier wrote this paper, right? And which constitutes the target of his paper. That's, in some ways a sort of surprising fact. So these days, I think it's hard to find philosophers agreeing on anything. Certainly not about something as contentious and difficult and fraught as the analysis of a heavy duty philosophical concept like knowledge. Of course, again, heavy duty in the sense that it's sort of material and it's significant and it matters. Not heavy duty in the sense that it's some abstruse concept. It's just the ordinary concept of knowing something, right? Nevertheless, as we saw early on, right, the attempt to give necessary and sufficient conditions for any concept often proves quite difficult. Okay, but in the 60s, I guess we were all a little more naive or something, a little more innocent, and many philosophers accepted the idea that knowledge could be captured in a few necessary and sufficient conditions. And the account, the analysis that Gettier is attacking, I've got it here in the title of this document here. It's often called the JTB theory of knowledge. And it's called the JTB theory of knowledge because there are 3 conditions of knowledge that were recognized. And the letters JTB, well, those will make sense in a minute. Here is the account, or if you like, the analysis that Gettier was attacking. Here's how the account goes. S knows that P, so just generic letters here. S is supposed to be shorthand for, any knower at all, any person, probably. P, well, this is why we talk about propositions. P for proposition or fact, anything that you can know, right? S knows that P, if and only if. So again, this if and only if captures the idea of conditions that are both necessary and sufficient. Okay, and here is the account. One, P is true, and I don't like this automatic capitalization. I don't want that. Condition 2, S believes that P, or sometimes expressed as S accepts that P, S accepts the truth of P, right? S would say that P is true. And finally, S is justified in their belief that P. Okay. Just using the gender neutral pronoun here, there, to refer back to S. Obviously, S could be male, could be female, could be something else. Okay. Okay, so here's the idea, right? P is true. You can only know things that are true. That seems right, right? I can't know that 2 + 2 is 5. Why? Because 2 + 2 just ain't 5, right? It's not something that I can know. It is something I suppose I could believe, maybe, if I'm sort of seriously deficient in arithmetical understanding. But it's not apparently something that I can know, because it's just not true. Okay. It might be something that I notice. It might be something that I think I know. It might be something that I think other people know, but it can't really be something that I know because it's not true. I have to believe that P, right? That is, the relevant fact has to be sort of in my head somewhere. There are lots of things that are true, and obviously that's not enough for knowledge, because some people know things and other people don't, and it's the very same true thing that we're talking about, right? Sometimes I know that something is true and you don't know that that same thing is true, or vice versa. And finally, the third condition, this is a bit pricklier, but it's often thought, generally accepted, that merely believing a true thing, I guess that's two conditions, is not sufficient for knowledge, right? And the thought is, well, you can just sort of get lucky, right? You can just kind of have a true belief by chance. And in that sort of case, we probably don't want to call that knowledge, right? So for example, if suppose that I'm very worried about the results of the Super Bowl. I'm optimistic that my Bengals are going to win it this year, and I want to believe it. But I don't really have a lot of justification for that belief, right? Not, if for no other reason than the fact that they've never won the Super Bowl before, sadly. But suppose that I want to try to convince myself that in fact they will win the Super Bowl. And suppose further that the way I go about convincing myself of this is not by actually collecting evidence about their skill level, or about, Burrow's success against ranked teams, or anything like that. What I do instead is I consult some fortune teller, right? And the fortune teller consults their crystal ball, and the fortune teller is gazing into the crystal ball, and the fortune teller says to me, yes, I see the Super Bowl happening a few weeks from today, and or whenever it is, and I see that the Bengals are indeed going to win the Super Bowl this year. Okay. And suppose, moreover, that I, being overly susceptible to the deliverances of fortune tellers, say, oh, right, that's excellent. Now I'm convinced that the Bengals are going to win the Super Bowl. Okay, so here I am with the belief that the Bengals are going to win the Super Bowl, and suppose, moreover, that the Bengals really do go win the Super Bowl, right? Well, that's a true belief that I had. The Bengals are going to win the Super Bowl. That's true, and I believed it. I believed it as soon as the fortune teller convinced me. Still, I think we don't want to say that I knew the Bengals were going to win the Super Bowl, right? Why? Because my belief that they would was based on something really shaky, right? We don't generally accept, fortune teller analysis as sort of justifying evidentiary reason to believe something. Right? So that's what's behind this third condition. The idea is you have to have a good reason to believe it. You have to have something like evidence. Okay. Or if the claim in question is, say, a philosophical claim, not subject to scientific investigation, then maybe what counts as justification is like a good argument or something like that. Okay, so if we put all those three conditions together, right, this is obviously the T part, this is obviously the B part, this is obviously the J part. That's our JTB theory of knowledge. And that might strike you as a pretty good analysis, right? Those conditions all do seem to be necessary for knowledge. And if you put them all together, that plausibly is sufficient for knowledge. Okay, but it's exactly that latter claim that Gettier attacks, right? So Gettier's argument, or let's just say the conclusion of Gettier's argument, is that these three conditions are not popular to widespread belief at the time, which is somewhere around 1963 or something is when this paper came out, not together sufficient for knowledge. Okay. And the way that Gettier argues for this is really just an exercise in imagination, right? So this is as good and clear an example of the power and importance of imagination for philosophy as anything I can think of. Right? So Gettier, all he does is he just imagines a few sort of far out cases. But it doesn't matter that they're far out, notice, right? Because what we're doing is we're testing the limits of a concept, of a conceptual analysis. And so that analysis is supposed to cover, right, not just what's actually true or what seems plausible or normal, but it's supposed to cover any sort of possible world at all, right? That's what concepts do. They're supposed to sort of survive the actual world, so to speak. And so that means that I'm free and Gettier is free to imagine all sorts of different scenarios, right? And we should be able to apply our concept of knowledge, and it ought to work. That is, we ought to recognize it as knowledge when we stipulate that these three conditions are holding in the relevant possible world of our fancy. So let's try to mimic a kind of so-called Gettier case, right? Again, this is a counterexample, right? This is a world in which someone seems to have all three of these conditions met. We've got some relevant S, we've got some relevant P. The P is true, S believes that P, S is justified in their belief that P, and yet still we're not inclined to say, and notice this is just a straightforward appeal to our own intuitions about the concept of knowledge, still we are not inclined to say that S really knows that P, okay? Or knows that P is true. Okay, so let's just talk about one simple example. This will just be one type of Gettier case, and I think you'll get the idea. Okay, so here's consider the following story. Okay. Suppose that a guy named Bob is sitting on a jury, and it's a capital murder trial, and Bob is sitting there listening to the evidence against the defendant here, and it looks pretty bad for the defendant, right? So the defendant's fingerprints are all over the murder weapon. The defendant's alibi at the time of the murder doesn't seem very good. The defendant doesn't really seem to remember much that would corroborate his alibi. The defendant, moreover, had something of a grudge against the deceased, right? And so, the defendant had reason, had motivation to commit the murder. So all is looking pretty bad for the defendant. And so Bob says, right, Bob believes that the defendant committed the murder. Okay. Let's make it worse. Suppose even that Bob's DNA was at the crime scene. Make it as bad as you like, right? We don't need Bob to be sort of unreasonable here. In fact, we want Bob to be, right, justified in his belief that the defendant committed the murder. Okay. So Bob believes that the defendant committed the murder. And, right, given all the evidence against the defendant, Bob is justified in his belief. Okay. So we have conditions 2 and 3 already, right? Now here's where Gettier is clever. Here's the trick. Okay. Suppose in fact that the defendant is actually innocent. Right? Suppose in fact that this belief is actually false. But Bob does a little bit of reasoning, right? And so Bob considers this belief, let's just put it like this, right? The defendant committed the murder. And suppose he's consulting with a fellow juror, and the fellow juror is saying, well, I'm not really sure, maybe Bob didn't do this as Bob. Sorry, maybe the defendant really didn't do this murder after all. Right. And eventually Bob gets sort of exasperated and he says something like this. Look, if the defendant didn't commit the murder, then my friend Jim is on Mars right now. Right. This is the sort of thing you say when you're entirely convinced of the truth of this, or rather, right, strictly speaking, the falsity of this, the truth of what's negated here. If he didn't commit the murder, then my friend Jim is on Mars right now. Right. I.e., I'm so convinced of the truth that the defendant did commit the murder that I also believe this crazy thing. Right. I don't, of course, believe that my friend Jim is on Mars, but that's just to say that I don't believe this antecedent here that the defendant didn't commit the murder. I believe the opposite, that the defendant did. Okay. Logically speaking, right, we can rewrite this as either the defendant committed the murder or my friend Jim is on Mars right now. Okay. These two are logically equivalent. Now, here's the trick. Okay. Here's the trick. Suppose the truth, right? So we're writing the story. We can have the truth of the story be whatever we like. Suppose the defendant is innocent. Okay. Yes, there's an awful lot of evidence that would seem to point toward the defendant, but suppose that it's some massive frame job. Okay. Suppose further that Jim was, let's just say, yesterday abducted by Martians and is now currently a prisoner on Mars. Oops. By Martians. Thanks, Google. All right. Now, this is an incredible story, but again, right, we don't need to repeat the idea there. We can have as incredible a story as we want. The concept of knowledge should still apply. Okay. So we're supposing that Jim was yesterday abducted by Martians. Jim is now currently a prisoner on Mars. Right. Now consider this sentence right here. Let's bold it. In fact, let's give it a name. Let's call this, I don't know. How about P1? Okay. And now consider Bob's relationship to P1. Well, let's see if it meets the conditions of knowledge, right? Is P1 true? Yes, it is, right? Not for the reason that Bob thinks it is, but it is, right? The defendant didn't commit the defendant did not commit the murder. This part's false, but this part is true, right? Jim is on Mars right now. That part of the disjunction is true, hence the whole disjunction is true, so that sentence is true. P1 is true. Moreover, Bob believes it, right? Why does Bob believe it? Well, he believes it because he believes this first part, right? If you believe a thing, then certainly you believe either that thing or something else. And indeed, for the same sort of reasoning, P1 is justified. Or sorry, I guess said a bit better, Bob is justified in his belief that P1. Why is it justified? Well, we're relying here on a principle that says that if some belief is justified, then any logical consequence from that belief is also justified. Right? So in particular, if this belief here, the defendant committed the murder, if that belief is justified, and we've basically stipulated that it is justified given all the evidence against the defendant, right? If this belief is justified, then all logical consequences of that would be justified as well. P1 is a logical consequence of that, right? I start with some belief, B, well then B or C, that's definitely a logical consequence of B. If B is justified, then so is B or C. Okay, so this claim right here seems to be such that it's true, Bob believes it, and Bob is justified in his belief in it. And yet, right? And yet, it doesn't seem to be the case. Just, consult your own intuitions here. Maybe you have different intuitions, but I doubt it. It doesn't seem to be the case that Bob knows P1. Right? Does Bob know that either the defendant committed the murder or his friend Jim is on Mars right now? No, it doesn't seem like it, right? Because he only thinks it true because of the first part, when in fact it's actually the second part that makes P1 true. Okay, so that's the idea. That's the structure of a Gettier case. Pardon me. Oh, I want to make a note here about, right, if the belief, well, let's just say it like this. If one belief, B, is justified, then so are all of the logical consequences of B. By logical consequence, I just mean things that are true if B is. Right? If it's true that the defendant committed the murder, then it's also true that either the defendant committed the murder or Bob's friend Jim is on Mars right now. Okay, that's sort of the structure of a Gettier case. Most philosophers read this paper that Gettier had written. This was not his original example. I've sort of modified it slightly, but this is the basic structure of it. And they said, good Lord, Gettier is right. We've all been accepting this analysis of knowledge, and now Gettier has come along and shown us that it's not complete, right? These three conditions don't seem sufficient after all for knowledge. And oddly enough, right, the whole reason we accepted the third condition in the first place is that we were sort of worried about sort of stumbling onto a true belief by accident. But now it seems that I can actually stumble onto a belief with justification, stumble onto a true belief with justification by accident. right? And it's that accidentalness, that accidental sort of feature of the case that tends to make most of us feel like this is not really a case of knowledge. Okay. Cool. Gettier, of course, in the space of 3 pages, does not offer any positive story here. He doesn't say, here's how we fix up the account. And so this has obviously been a large open question for the last 60 years in current epistemology. In fact, most epistemologists these days aren't even really worried with the sort of big question of what knowledge is. They've had a lot more to say about what the nature of justification is. Right. And there's some hope that if we could just get clearer about this concept, right, this, as it were, narrower concept with broader application, if we could just get clearer about that, then maybe we could restore to some degree anyway this previous account of knowledge that we all thought was right. All right, that's it for now. Have a good time reading and studying, and I will see you all next time.